All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How COVID-19 Has Affected Women in the Workforce. We really appreciate your attendance today, and the information we're going to be talking about is very important, so we really thank you for being here. My name is Holden Andrews. I will be the host for today. Our two speakers are Chris Chmura, who is our CEO and Chief Economist, and then Patrick Clapp, who is also an economist here. As always, we like to give a little primer on who Chmura is and what we do. So we provide labor market data and analysis so our clients can make informed decisions in order to help their communities and businesses thrive. Chmura Economics and Analytics was founded in 1999 by Chris. And there are two offices, one in Richmond, Virginia, and the other in Cleveland, Ohio. So we are a group of economists, data scientists, statisticians, and business professionals who care about helping your community and your business grow. Two things that we are driven by are client satisfaction and success. And then, as you'll see on our next slide as well, excellence is really our first priority, both in customer service and in data quality. So this slide right here are kind of our guiding values or pillars. So the first is that of excellence, and then additionally we have thorough, accurate, and useful. And these four ideals are really what guide us as an organization. They drive us, and they are what we aspire to be and to do every single day. One way we really try to exemplify these values is through our weekly economic update. This report is sent out for free once a week with the most up-to-date national data on labor markets and all that good stuff. So if you would like to be on this, I'm going to put a link in the chat here in a few minutes, and you'll get that from Chris once a week. So before I pass things off, I do want to mention that both the slides that you're seeing on your screen and the recording of this webinar will be sent out to all attendees tomorrow, just so you can review it further and share it with coworkers and all those other great things. So finally, if you have any questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. You'll also see some offers and relevant links and other things coming through in the chat, so keep an eye on there. And again, we really appreciate you being here. So with that being said, I'll pass things off to Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Holden. Thanks, Holden. You broke out a little bit there, but so sorry for talking on top of you. Today's topic is women in the workforce, but before we get to that, first I'll be giving us now in Minnesota and California, and the person from Minnesota was at a conference in New York City. So we are closely watching that with regard to what impact that might have on the economy. The job market remains tight and the participation is low. We'll look at that. And then Patrick will talk to us about COVID, how it has affected women in the workforce. And I have a note from Patrick that my voice is coming and going, so I'm just going to quickly pull my this cord out and put it back in. I'll be right back. Okay. Can you all hear me now? I see Lori Strump couldn't hear me.
You're coming through clearly for me, Chris.
Okay, great. Thanks, Holden. All right, so first the national overview. We've been in this COVID crisis for almost 2 years, and if you've been on our previous webinars, then you know that around the globe, a recession is defined as 2 consecutive drops in GDP. But here in the US, we have the National Bureau of Economic Research, who has a group of people in a business dating cycle committee, and they look at monthly data to decide when a recession begins and ends. And in gray, you see here that they identified March as the beginning of the recession and April as the end of it. So it was 2 months long but it was very severe because of the lockdown. We lost all our jobs from the previous expansion, and now we're pulling ourselves out of that hole, but we're still short of the pre-COVID numbers. Tomorrow, we're going to see another data point. The November employment data will be coming out at 8:30 tomorrow morning. On the right is personal consumption and income. This is spending by consumers. It's extremely important because they make up about 60 to 70% of GDP. So consumption again dropped off as we went into the lockdown period. Here you see it coming back, and then last summer, as COVID was decreasing, people were getting out more and spending, and now it's back to more normal levels, still, I guess, above typical levels, around 8%. Income, on the other hand, jumped because of all of the stimulus that the federal government was giving in terms of the unemployment insurance increases and sums of money going to individuals or households. That came back down and jumped back up again twice because of stimulus payments to households. And now you see it again. That's something that's a little more normal, about 5% growth year over year. Down below, we're looking at industrial production. So that's output from utilities, manufacturing, mining. And you could see again, percent change from a year ago. It plummeted, and then it spiked as we were coming out of the lockdown period, and now more close to a normal period of time. So on this next slide, even though the recession was just 2 months long, it was 2 quarters long because it straddled 2 quarters. March and April straddles the first and second quarter. You could see the big decline, the rebound. Our latest information was around 2% growth, and that was in the third quarter. That's when the Delta variant popped up. Looking at our forecast, it's around 4 to 5% for the next year and a half. But again, this is pre-Omicron variant, and we would expect this to be a very good Christmas. But if the Omicron variant hits the U.S. hard, then we'd expect to see something maybe closer to 2% here. So again, we're watching that closely. Here you can see the current recession was shorter but deeper than the Great Recession we had just around 2008, which was the worst recession we had seen since the Great Depression. Now here, talking about the Omicron spike protein, another site that I found that has good data on the virus and the Delta variants. And here, this picture, if anyone's a scientist, this probably makes a lot of sense to you. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me, except for that we're seeing a progression here. So there were 4 unique spikes, mutations with alpha. Then we had the beta variant. There were 6 spike mutations, 8 spike mutations with gamma, 10 with the Delta variant. And now with this new Omicron variant, we're seeing 26 spikes, mutations. And the quote that they have explaining it is, Omicron has highest novel spike mutations, including striking clusters on the crown, suggesting significant selection pressure and antigenetic distinction from prior strains. So hopefully if someone's a scientist, that makes a lot of sense to you. But from my understanding, what that means is that it spreads faster. So that is the concern. And of course, you all know that it started in South Africa, or that's what they believe it did. At this point, there's still not a lot of information on it. From what we're hearing, there are milder symptoms, but 10% of individuals getting it in South Africa were children. And also the general population is not as vaccinated as the US and is younger, those getting it. So that could be why it's milder, because younger people are getting it. But again, not enough information now to know how this is going to impact the economy. And so for that reason, we're going to watch this closely. Now, when we get to the labor force, this has been a very atypical recession. So typically at this point of a recovery, it would be an employer's market. That is, there would be plenty of people out there willing to work, and wages would not be going up. But you see the unemployment rate has been dropping very quickly and not too far off of the low rates that we saw before going into COVID. On the right, participation rate is low. Gray shaded areas are recessions. And here you can see in the 1970s, participation rate rose as women were coming into the labor force. Baby boomers were coming in. It peaked out around 67% and has been sliding since then as people have been retiring. But we saw the plummet during the COVID lockdown, and it's bounced back a little, but many people think we're not going to get back to previous COVID levels. Reasons for that, because we're seeing people retire early. There are some people who fear contracting the virus, and so they're not coming back into the workforce. Now, these last two things were issues that ended in September, and so we thought we would have seen a little bounce in October. It'll be interesting to see if the November numbers are any better when we see them tomorrow. But there were some parents staying at home because their children were schooling online, and then also there was the additional unemployment insurance through Labor Day. And both of those have ended, and we've still not seen the rebound. So here we are in a period where demand is coming back for goods and services. Businesses are trying to hire more people, and it's like they have this double whammy because they're not coming back, and then they're also quitting. So this is a survey that comes from the BLS, and it shows you the quit rate. And not a surprise, gray shaded areas during recessions, people don't quit their jobs as much, because if they quit their jobs and go to another one, they're not sure that that new firm they're going to is going to continue to have the demand to keep them employed. So coming out of recessions, though, we usually see the quit rate rise. Not as substantially as we saw the quit rate rise coming out of the current recession. And right now we're looking at record levels. 4.4 million people quit their jobs in September. That's the latest data available. And the quit rate as a percent of employment rose to 3%. So people now, as they've gone through this period of reflection, considering other jobs, some have gotten training to go into other positions, but we're seeing people at a very high rate leaving their current jobs and going on to different ones. Of course, whether or not they could stay at home to work may be driving some of that as well. So here's another look at the JOLTS data, the job openings. And in green, you can see the job openings. There are plenty of openings out there, over 9,000, but the hires are much lower. The participation rate is much lower. The skills of the people that we're looking for are not there, perhaps in the geographic regions that we want them. So very definitely an odd type of labor market going through right now after coming out of this severe recession. Patrick's going to be talking to you more about how women have been coming back into the labor force and how they have been more severely affected. And part of that is due to the industry. So he'll be showing you this for female workers only, but here I'm showing this information for all workers. So we've indexed employment to 100. That's fourth quarter before COVID started. And the way to read this now is we saw a drop almost down to 60, meaning that in this industry, accommodative and food services, they lost about 40% of their employment. So it was one of the worst industries. These industries that I'm showing you are those that more women work in. And Patrick, again, will give you more information on that. So here's through the latest data, and notice that we're still looking at, for accommodation food services, employment is 10% below the 100 mark, 10% below pre-COVID levels. When we look at education services, another industry that women are more prevalent in than men, you can see it didn't drop off as much, but again, we're about 10% below. And this is our forecast for when we're going to get back to pre-COVID levels, looking at the end of next year for many of these. Green is other services. This would be things like religious organizations, personal care services, dry cleaning, social advocacy. And you could see the drop off was about 20%, but again, we're still about 5% below pre-COVID levels. Purple, healthcare and social assistance. We saw a drop off still below pre-COVID levels, but as we go forward into 2023, we expect this industry to continue to grow. And then finally, finance insurance, one that did not drop off much at all because many of these workers can work from home. And also within finance is mortgage servicing and we've seen a boom in construction and mortgage activity. So that is currently above pre-COVID levels and expected to grow at a modest rate there. So looking now to the holiday selling season, it's expected to be very good if inventories hold up. The National Retail Federation forecasts sales every year, and they're looking for 8.5 to 10.5 above last year's level. And this indicator excludes auto dealers, gas, and restaurants out of retail sales. On average, it's picked up 4.4% for the past 5 years. So that gives you a sense of how strong this is. Previous highs were 8.2%. But then again, remember, we've got some inflation in here that's pushing rates up from a year ago. Deloitte also gives a forecast, but instead of looking at November and December, it looks at November through January compared to a year ago. They're not quite as optimistic. 7 to 9% is what they're looking for. But both groups expect e-commerce sales to be up 11 to 15%. Interesting anecdotes coming out on that it seems that more people are going to the stores at least so far in the holiday selling season. In part, is at least people who have been interviewed is because they want to get out because they haven't over the past year. And consumers have cash to spend. The latest data we have are kind of old from the Fed. First quarter 2021, 136.9 trillion household wealth. That's a record number. And balances in cash, checking accounts, and savings deposits were a record 14.5 trillion. Another indicator, the S&P is up 20% this year. And inventory issues may be a problem. If so, more people would be buying gift cards. And you may wonder, when does a gift card get recorded in retail sales? And it's not until it's redeemed. So even though it may be purchased in December, it won't show up until January or February if they buy it. Interesting story in the New York Times on November 30th, entitled "Supply Chain Problems Have Small Retailers Gambling on Hoarding." So this article talked about a running store in Connecticut who typically has 3,000 pairs of shoes at this period of time. But earlier, when she heard that there may be shortages, she made sure her inventory had 4,100, but she's having to extend her credit to make that bet. So there are some small businesses, in particular retail, that have increased their inventories because of everything we've heard about potential shortages. So overall, U.S. economy is doing well. Sales and GDP have recovered. It's the employment that we're still waiting on. The job market may be tight for a couple of years to come. And in the supply chain issues, some businesses are already starting to report that they're resolving to some extent, but that most expect them not to resolve until, say, the middle of 2022 or even later than that. So with that, let me turn it over to Patrick. And again, please put your questions in the chat and we'll get those at the end of this presentation.
All right, thanks, Chris. I think I've got the screen now. Happy to join you today to discuss this topic. I'm so glad that so many of you have joined to talk about this particular impacts of the pandemic on women in the workforce. Certainly a lot of questions going on, and I hope we can cover, provide some good information for you today. So you may have heard that the impacts from the pandemic have been harder on women. We've got some data to show that pretty clearly here. Prior to the pandemic, in the fourth quarter of 2019, there were fewer women than men working in the nation. A gap of about 5.3 million women fewer than men. As the pandemic started impacting the nation and really hit at its worst in the second quarter of 2020, women's jobs declined faster than men, widening that gap to 5.4 million. And importantly, also during the recovery, jobs that held by women have been recovering more slowly than jobs held by men prior to the impact of the pandemic. So that gap has continued to widen. As the latest data, the second quarter of 2021 reached a gap of 5.8 million. So that's 500,000 fewer women than men in the workforce since before the pandemic. I want to talk a little bit about why that is, and also some variation across the states, and a little bit of some information you might be able to take back to your own communities. One main big reason for the decline, as Chris was showing, some of the most impacted sectors, women make up a majority or account for a much larger share of employment in some industries than others. And many of those industries were hit the hardest during the pandemic. In particular, a lot of those in-person service jobs that require face-to-face interaction, accommodation and food services took the biggest hit, as Chris showed, about 40%, and almost 54% of those jobs pre-pandemic were held by women. Healthcare and social assistance, educational services, finance and insurance, all largely majority women. And on the other side, sectors with a smaller share of women also tended to face less of an impact. So things like transportation and warehousing and manufacturing, which benefited from rise of a shift in manufacturing within the nation and the rise of e-commerce and growth in transportation and warehousing, already had fewer women working in those sectors, which inhibited the ability to regain those jobs and didn't provide as much of a buffer for job losses. I've also included here some of the more evenly split sectors. Retail trade is right around 50% nationally, and was also significantly hit from that in-person, face-to-face interaction declines. Arts, entertainment, and recreation, and professional and scientific and technical services is a little bit closer split, but again, like finance and insurance that Chris mentioned earlier, is one of those industries that people can perform work remotely and in a lot of cases, and was less hit by the pandemic. So that variation explains a lot of the job losses. But during the job losses in some sectors, women actually bore a greater brunt of the job losses. I've highlighted here, we're showing the percentage in the fourth quarter of 2019 versus the second quarter of 2020. And some of these changes are pretty small, but like from 78.1% to 77.8%. But when you're talking about so many workers losing their jobs, especially in something like accommodation and food services, that extra brunt of the impact can really translate to a large number of additional jobs lost. This also translated to even in some of the low percentage female sectors like transportation, warehousing, manufacturing, women were also more likely to lose their jobs in these sectors as well. So what does the trend line look like for this? As Chris mentioned previously, I've set up this chart as an index relative to the fourth quarter of 2019. So again, we can see that percent change. It's a little bit messy with a lot of lines here, but I'll try and talk through a few of them and zoom in and out a bit to get you some details. So first thing to look at really is this sharp drop in accommodation and food services and arts, entertainment, and recreation. As Chris showed, overall, these were heavily hit industries. And as we're looking specifically at female employment here, you can see this is where a lot of the job losses are overall. And in the recovery, speaking about that widening gap, I think overall accommodation and food services was closer to 90% overall. You can see hovering around 85% of the fourth quarter 2019 values as of the middle of the year here. So recovering a little bit slower overall as well. We've got a bit of a seasonal spike in agriculture, just to call out why that's growing up here. But I also want to point to other services, which is, as Chris mentioned, includes a wide variety of personal care services. But I think it's also helpful to point to private household employment, like maids and nannies and caretakers, which are included in here and much more likely to be held by women. And also experienced this sharp drop and slower recovery here. If we remove some of those that we just talked about and zoom in a little bit more, we can look at some other industries of interest like administrative and support, retail trade, both of which had a sharp drop, almost 84% here of where they were in the fourth quarter of 2019. And it can be hard to maybe follow some of these lines, but retail trade, which had more of that closer to a 50-50 split between men and women. The employment for women has stalled at about just under 95% recovery relative to the pre-pandemic level for retail trade. Educational services, interestingly, is falling a bit of a pattern that we've seen in the Great Recession. Some of this is seasonal, like we saw with agricultural a second ago, as summer vacation takes hold here. But in the Great Recession, educational services had a kind of similar lag in job losses and recovery. The industry tends to not so much fire employees as to not rehire for positions which have been vacated. So that's how these job losses tend to show up and show a bit of a lag in the industry. So what the last two slides mean for looking at impacts in your regions, there's very different stories for different industries, and the industry mix and percentage of women within them can really drive different outcomes and tell a story of where women are being impacted and why they've lost so many jobs. On this slide, we zoom in one more time at some of those which experienced less of an impact, like Chris was saying earlier about finance and insurance, or professional, scientific, and technical services. A much smaller dip in employment here and risen above pre-pandemic levels already, but still not enough to offset some of those larger job losses in industries like accommodation and food services. Healthcare and social assistance was the highest sector with the highest percentage of female employment, still at about 97% of pre-pandemic levels. And interestingly, transportation and warehousing, which has really seen a boom across the nation with the adoption of e-commerce and supply chain reconfigurations. Briefly, female employment in the sector rose above pre-pandemic levels, but it's actually been declining over the past several quarters. So women missing out a bit on some of that recovery. So what does this mean for your region? There is definitely some geographic variation. I've called out a few points here, but I also want to be sure to direct you to our blog. I've got a link at the bottom here, which has multiple maps and fully interactive, so you can hover over and see what's going on in your state. But the overall, the number of female job losses by state tends to follow how many jobs were lost in a state and overall population. So I'll skip over that for a little bit and look instead at the difference in percentage points between percentage of jobs lost by men and percentage of jobs lost by women. So blue here is going to mean that a positive number that women are doing slightly better than men in terms of job losses. But you can see most of the map is in this orange and red shade, indicating, like we saw at the national level, that women were more severely impacted. A couple of points to call out, and how some of those industry mixes and local policies on shutdowns can impact some of this. In New Hampshire and Maine and New Jersey had the largest percentage point difference, as those shutdowns really impacted the in-person service jobs, and there was less resilience from manufacturing and transportation warehousing, which helped some of the other areas. On the other hand, women lost a smaller share of jobs than men, and those blue states highlighted there, Wyoming, New York, and North Dakota. In this case, there were still severe losses in accommodation and food services and arts, entertainment, and recreation, but they were more evenly split between the genders. And there were also an offset from relatively better impacts for women in some of those positions which are better for work from home or face less of an impact, like finance and insurance. In terms of the recovery, we're looking here through the second quarter of 2021 at the state-by-state difference. And we've introduced a new color here, this kind of gray in Nevada and Texas, where there's more of an even recovery in accommodation and food services, and some growth in a couple other sectors with a large percentage of women. Blue still here is going to indicate jobs for women recovering faster than for men. In these states, typically there were fewer impacts due to the shutdowns, so less to recover from. And there's also been a boost from professional, scientific, and technical services and real estate to help boost those numbers. Still, most of the map is going to be in that orange and red color. Interestingly, for Idaho and Utah, it's actually because these states have recovered beyond their initial level and continue to expand overall employment, but women are trailing men, even if they have recovered to the pre-pandemic levels. So it's we need to ask at this point, why is that difference in recovery between genders? And it's still an ongoing question, and there's plenty of research going on about it right now. One suggestion has been, is there a role from school closures? Women are more likely to be the caretakers in a household, might need to stay home and monitor a child who's doing virtual school. It's just something speculated. We actually have some data on return to school right now, and it doesn't seem to be really moving the needle much. There's an interesting Brookings study that I've linked here, which takes a look at that month-by-month change from virtual to in-person schooling. You can see in the lighter blue lines on the chart here, all of that monthly, or all of that statewide variation on virtual schooling. And the darker line here is that average with a break for summer break and return to mostly in-person schooling eventually. So you can compare that against the women returning to the workforce and see, is that a factor? But in the results were actually not statistically significant. So not statistically significant from zero. So take the explanatory power with that in mind. But they found that school closures seem to be a factor, but can only explain maybe a sixth of the shortfall in women's participation in the labor force. And interestingly, the results show a similar impact for fathers of young children, not just mothers, as well as women without young children. So there are a couple other reasons floating around at the moment. But one reason that's going to be true for anybody who's been out of the labor force for a period of time, there's a lot of research on this. It's much more difficult to return to the labor force after you haven't searched for a while. Part of that is the just being out of having to update your resume and show a gap in there. Part of that is skills coming out of date. For women specifically, as called out here in the report, they might make other commitments, particularly around children, maybe stay at home until the youngest children start school, now that they're out of the labor force. And they may also make other commitments, like enrolling or re-enrolling themselves in school for additional training. How about increasing the female labor force participation? Is there anything that we should look at and possibly that could possibly help with this? Prior to the pandemic, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco looked into why Canadian labor force participation seemed to be so much higher than the participation in the US. And as you can see in the chart on the right here, which looks at labor force participation rates for women and men, while the rates are fairly similar for men, participation from women in Canada has very much been rising since at least 2000, separating from the US, which has been declining through 2018. So 3/4 of that gap in labor force participation could be explained by the women not in the labor force in the US. And in their research, they pointed to a few key factors that were important for increasing participation in Canada, including parental leave policies, subsidizing childcare, and flexible work arrangements. Now, barring national or statewide policy to help with these matters, as employers are looking to bring women into their workforce, to the extent that the benefits can be offered or the clear barrier of parental needs and childcare can be addressed, that could be expected to make it easier for women to return to the labor force and fill those open positions. Other factors that you might want to consider in taking this back to your localities. I know that predominantly male industries like manufacturing, construction, this was a known issue prior to the pandemic and continues to be, of getting women into these fields. There were several programs already in place in workforce and education for helping to resolve those barriers for women to join the field and specifically recruit women into some of these growing in-demand fields. They continuing to return to these and expand these is a potential option. And interestingly, one of the current narratives that I don't have a lot of data for, unfortunately, is we're hearing that a lot of people and women in particular are not interested in returning to work in those service industries, that they, having experienced the volatility of accommodation and food services, for example, or retail, that they're looking for alternatives and taking the time and out of the labor force and break in the day-to-day work to really reconsider alternative paths. Combine that with using time out of the labor force to return to school and gain new skills, and there's a potential opportunity to train those workers into in-demand fields and help women find a new place within the labor market. We also should consider the race and ethnicity and disparate impacts here as well. So I've got a link at the bottom here to some interesting research from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors on COVID-19 labor force exits specifically. And the groups that they looked at, they found much higher than average exiting, specifically for women with children under age 6, women with young children, lower earning women with school-age children. Again, maybe in that household budget, considering the benefit of continuing to work and paying for childcare versus just staying home out of the labor force. And of course, as we've heard several stories, Latinas and Black women relative to white women experiencing a greater impact from the pandemic, even controlling for other factors like household and occupation and industry. So there are often local organizations and networks and nonprofits specifically trying to work with and reach out to these populations. And as you are interested in women returning to the workforce and bringing them back into needed positions, leveraging those networks as a way to connect can really help you develop these strategies specific to these groups that were impacted. And finally, for those of you who are JobsEQ subscribers, we have a few analytics in the tool, which would be particularly helpful for you in looking for possible opportunities for jobs with similar skills and an attractive wage, the willing and able analytic in JobsEQ. You can insert a particular code, like here, waiters and waitresses, and see what are the related opportunities that they might need without much training. I've highlighted stockers and order fillers on the example here as we discussed the different impacts in transportation and warehousing as a potential example. But of course, you also can see a large number of dots on the willing but not able side of the chart here. Again, a potential opportunity for taking those who are reconsidering career opportunities and considering additional paths to open up with using some of the skills they might have, and particularly soft skills, which are often in demand, and transitioning to related careers in growing areas. The JobsEQ industry characteristics analytic has the employment by gender and industry breakouts that we've shown on previous slides here and used in the blog post that I mentioned earlier. If you wanted to conduct a similar analysis of male and female employment impacts in your region, we show the latest quarter of data in JobsEQ, which can vary state by state. But I've also included a link here to a nice tool from the Census Bureau to explore the raw source of these data, the quarterly workforce indicators, if you wanted to look at the time series there. And lastly, another lens to look at these impacts that we might explore in a future blog or webinar post is the employment by gender and occupation. You can see the percentage of employment by occupation and the occupation characteristics. As probably not as a surprise, given what we've talked about, you can see a high percentage of women in healthcare support occupations and personal care and service occupations, for example. You can combine that with the historical occupation employment data that we have available in a couple of places in Jobs EQ to look at how those women held jobs or jobs which have a large percentage of women might have been impacted by the pandemic. With that, that's the end of our slides for today. I'd like to open it up to questions on either my section or Chris's. So just let us know in chat.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Great information. Now, the previous slide that you just showed, although you showed it for nursing, healthcare, whatever, we can go all the way down to the level of the 6-digit code, like registered nurse versus marketing analyst, et cetera, correct?
Yes, absolutely. We have all of these data at the detailed 6-digit stock level. Okay,
great. And while you're looking at maybe some of the questions for you, let me try to address one that Rory asked early on. And it was a long question, but it was basically, where have all the people gone that are not in the labor force anymore, with the participation rate being so low? And there were two questions there. Are they taking a chance that they can find better jobs, or are they dropping out altogether? It may be either of those, Corey, but one thing that I've been meaning to do, and since you asked that question, I hopped online and got some numbers. And I'll write a blog on this, or I write a column for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Maybe I'll do my column on this. But so of the money that has been available, do some of these individuals have enough cash that they're not willing to go back to the market yet, or don't need to? So the CARES Act, first round, each adult was given $1,200 directly deposited in their bank account. Children were given $500. Of course, this dropped off the more money you earn. So if you earn more than $70,000, or it was phased out completely at certain dollar levels that I don't have in front of me right now. During the second round, okay, each adult received $600, each child $600. During the third round, the latest America's Rescue Plan, so March 21, each single or each adult received $1,400. Each eligible child received $1,400. So over this period of a little over a year, if you were married with one child, you would have received $8,900. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot of money, but let's pull in one more factor. So let's say you were in Virginia, you became unemployed, you were at a retail establishment or maybe a restaurant. In Virginia, you received $378 a month. Well, that's the maximum amount that you could receive. And on top of that, this latest act put an extra $300 from the federal government. So you were receiving $678,000 a week, which turns out to be about $35,256 a year, which is equivalent to $16.95 an hour. So if you were making $12 an hour, then you were better off staying on this unemployment insurance because you were making more money. And so you could stay there and then consider other alternative employment, or see if something better would come along. Or like Patrick talked about, you can get trained on something that will pay more. So what I'm trying to say is that ran out in September. So some individuals were getting paid more money to not work than to work where they were working previously. And on top of that, they might have been sitting on that $8,900 that they had collected from the stimulus plans. And the wealth data that I showed you earlier and the amount of money in people's savings account would support that idea. So it may be, Rory, that people right now, some people, lower paid individuals, are able to still have a little bit of money, maybe through another month or two, before they really have to start looking for a job. And then some others may have decided, yes, they don't want to work anymore, retired early, so they've totally dropped out, or might have become discouraged workers.
Thanks for that answer, Chris. We also have a question from Casey Ashton. Are you able to look at race and gender together for occupations? I'm not sure if you or Patrick want to take that, but
I can take that one.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, the data that we have in Jobs EQ, at least, you can look at, and that were used throughout this presentation, you can only look at race or gender. Unfortunately, not that additional class.
So Patrick, is that something so we have a consultant side of the business and we have the Jobs EQ software side of the business. Is that something that you could do as a consulting project?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of this research actually started from some of our consulting work, and we decided to expand it out to the national level. But depending on the region, there are a couple data sources that come to mind that I think we might be able to help break that out.
Awesome. Just as it comes up, I will put a link to our contact form in the chat, and if you're interested in, the potential for a consulting study or anything like that, you can just fill out that form, and we'll get your contact information to our consulting team. But as we move forward with the questions, we've got another from Rory. What are the new stable jobs and stable job numbers? What do those represent again?
So stable jobs are when somebody receives earnings from the same employer for 3 quarters in a row. New stable jobs would be at the end of those first 3 quarters. Hope that helps. It's a nice way of looking at people who are staying in their jobs a little bit longer and made it through that first round of finding a good fit.
Next, we have the question from Michael White in the chat. Are you seeing significantly different trends with women in education, depending on age or experience? They say that their region of focus seems to be seeing younger and less experienced and older and highly experienced educators leaving.
Interesting. I thought at first this was going to be about education, highest level of education attained, but it seems to be about the education sector in particular. I have not looked at this specifically, and Chris, maybe you might have a little bit more on this, but I know that there's been, even before the pandemic, significant churn in first and second year teachers. The industry has a tendency to rely on a lot of new graduates, and teacher tenure can really vary place by place. For older and highly experienced educators, Chris touched on this a little bit before, that a lot of people may make the decision to go ahead and retire a little bit earlier than they had considered, rather than face the difficulties of teaching in a virtual environment and COVID environment.
Yeah, and Michael, I would say that what you're saying there, my region of focus seems to be seeing younger, less experienced, and older, high experienced educators leaving. Anecdotally, that's what we're hearing in different places around the country, but we don't have data on that yet. And then I see Holden that Diana asked, have you any data on wage inflation and or compression? So the wage data we've been getting from the BLS that comes out monthly, and we have seen higher wages, in part because of the occupations that are in those numbers. That is, the lower skilled workers or the lower paid workers that are in retail or accommodation and food services are not able to social distance as much, and so they were not in the numbers as much as people who work in offices that can work from home. And so that was skewing the data a little bit on the higher side. So some of the numbers, some of the wages going up may not be inflation as much as it is the mix of occupations right now. But then I saw Chuck Peterson on the line, on the webinar here. He's in Richmond. He does a great job doing research in the Richmond area. And I've seen him use our job postings. So about 10 to 15% of the job postings will also list a wage. So if you go in there and look at the wage, and I think this is the way Chuck did it, he looked at the current wages that are being offered by the particular jobs now, compare that to the wages that were being offered a year ago in our occupational wage information. And from that perspective, there has been, you can identify some wage inflation occurring.
Awesome. Well, if there, Chris, Patrick, and I will stick around for another minute or two if there are any further questions. But if not, we're coming right up on our 4 o'clock end time. So with that, we thank you for joining. And as we said earlier, the slides and recording will be sent out sometime tomorrow. So thanks again for joining.